my family lost their licenses because they didn't have papers. And so all of a sudden I saw how my dad, who was a pastor at the time, had to actually take our cousins to school and had to drastically be able to show up and be in solidarity with my own family members who were scared to take their kids to school, scared to drive to work. So I grew up in this contradiction, right? Of knowing that our values here in the South of welcoming, knowing that the grand majority of us actually do care for each other, while at the same time understanding that that wasn't happening in terms of what the policies were and how my family and many other families across the state were directly impacted by decisions that people in power were making. And so I share this story for a little bit of context, because by the time that I make it into college, and by the time I start getting involved in a million different school clubs and a million different places, I saw some Quakers in the house. So by the time I got recruited by American Friends Service Committee to start doing a little bit of advocacy around my story of growing up in a household of 6 different immigration statuses, and bringing educational awareness to just the different conditions that immigrants live across the state. At the same time that this was happening, the first Trump administration was getting ready to go into effect. And I remember just feeling completely isolated. I remember feeling completely scared of not knowing what was going to come. And I share this story because this is how Siembra got started. It got started with a few of us who knew that we couldn't just sit this out. It started with a few of us who knew that it was going to take a group of people who understood that it um, wasn't just about supporting immigrants through a really tough time, but that it really came down to we needed to recruit more people to not sit on the bench and to not just watch things happen, but to take action themselves. And so at that time, there wasn't really a statewide organization that was doing the kind of community defense that we had started to see was the need on the ground. I would get calls every day as one of the organizers' interns at AFSC. And then later on, as part of the director of the Latino Family Center, I got calls every day from moms, from parents. They were calling in saying that their kids were getting bullied because they were getting told to go back to Mexico. We had teachers calling us because they didn't know what to do about their parents and their kids who weren't coming to school anymore because they were scared. Of course, in the Triangle, remember a really rough time when some students actually got detained at school bus stops in the Durham area. So we know that this was a moment of intense fear in our communities and a moment where it was not clear what the path was going to be forward. And so we created Siembra out of this need, but also out of the value that we weren't going to just live our lives in fear, but that we believed that if we band together, just like many other movements, just like Black liberation movements, just like worker movements across the South have taught us that when we come together, we can survive this and we can actually organize for more power. So that's the spirit that we organized in Siembra. And so in 2017, I became the very first volunteer with 2 other volunteers that started Siembra. And we started a hotline. We started taking calls of people who started hearing rumors, people who started saying, I saw on Facebook that that ICE is outside of Walmart. And then all of a sudden there was like 100 text threads of people that were scared to go to school because that Walmart was on the way to school, for example. And so we knew that creating a hotline, that was able to give verified information about where there actually were dangers or interactions of ICE arrests actually happen, but B, that actually dispelled the rumors. And it's actually, no, that's not, there's nobody at Walmart. We checked it out. We sent a volunteer that was trained, and there's actually nothing there. And so we started this network where we verified and we made sure that we stopped rumors so that our people were actually able to assess their safety based off of real verified information, while at the same time training thousands of people to be part of a community that was going to stand up for each other. I'm going to share my screen here. Can folks see my screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so that's the spirit of how we got started. So a little bit more about who we are, right? So we're a grassroots Latina organization. We fight alongside other immigrant communities as well, but the folks who started Siembra are Latine, and have been focused on really organizing and recruiting Latinos to kind of band together. We have member committees. So like I said, we started out as 3 volunteers, and now we have hundreds of members that are now based and have committees in Guilford County, Alamance, Durham, Wake, Johnston, Cabarrus, and Randolph. And so, yeah, we got started in January 2017, and we primarily organize around two of what we see as the major threats that immigrants face in North Carolina. Of course, family separation, which was the original moment of crisis that we banded together to create Siembra. But there's actually another really huge threat that a lot of folks sometimes don't think of as an immigrant issue, but very much so. We have heard we always say every other member of ours has either been directly impacted by this or knows somebody in their immediate circle that was impacted by this, which is wage theft. I don't know if y'all had heard this before, but North Carolina ranks as the worst having the worst labor protection laws in the country. It's actually ranked number 51, which means that even our compas colonized in Puerto Rico have better labor practices than North Carolina as a state. And so I say this because this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? I think as we start to see uh, ways in which the Trump administration is going to make a lot of families live in fear, it doesn't live in a vacuum that we're also exploited for our labor. And especially in North Carolina, as we think about being number one in business, we continue to have the worst labor protections, and that is not a coincidence. And so, yeah, and so we've organized primarily around these two things. Now, today we're going to be doubling down on family separation. And one of the really important things to kind of keep in context is, especially in this moment, there's a lot of nonsense that the administration is kind of sharing with us. And at the end of the day, it becomes a challenge kind of knowing what's what and what is an actual danger to our neighbors and to immigrants in our state. And so I always like to start with just a little bit about how do ICE detentions actually happen in our state? Like, how are families being separated in our state? And there's 4 key ways that family separations happens in our state. The number one is what ICE likes to call community arrest. This is the sneakiest of the many ways that they do a lot of these detentions. And what community arrest means is that this is kind of where you start to see videos or you hear of ICE outside of a primarily Latino neighborhood, for example. And for lack of a better word, like they lurk, right? They kind of wait and they see activity going of people going in and out. They wait for um, immigrants and Latinos to actually leave to go to their workplace and then usually detain them and pull them over on their way to work. These detentions usually happen at like 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 or 8, bright and early in the morning when they know that someone is getting ready to go to work. The other thing that's important to know about these so-called community arrests is that there's a lot of collateral arrests that actually happen. And so the way that this works is that they might be stalking to look for Kelly in this neighborhood. But if they find Andrea in this neighborhood and they ask for Andrea's ID and they suspect that Andrea may not have papers, Andrea is now being detained if she complies and gets out of the car and gives her ID, etc. And so I say this because 9 times out of 10, what we saw happen between 2017 and 2020 is that the majority of these detentions were collateral detentions, which means they didn't even find the right person and they still took that person in. We'll come back to talk a little bit more about how we've protected ourselves against this, but this is one of the most common ways that we have seen this in North Carolina. And the other important thing to say is they also developed, this was an escalation in like 2018 and 2019. They started doing community arrests because voters in North Carolina actually voted for sheriffs who actually did not agree with collaborating with ICE. And so what this means is that voters decided that that families should not be separated and that sheriffs should not have a big say and actually would not keep our community safe if they continue to collaborate with ICE. And as retaliation, they would have press conference saying, okay, Durham, Wake, Guilford County sheriffs no longer work with ICE, and so therefore we have to do their job for them. And so that they would hold press conferences that would confirm this kind of retaliation practice. Another way that family separations happen, this is probably the one that we've seen the most, and that I think is important to say that this is really a bipartisanship. This isn't a nonpartisanship issue. Our people have been detained since 9/11, since the creation of Homeland Security. We've been resisting every step of the way as a people. And so I want to just name that because especially this kind of detention has continued to happen, especially in specific counties who have really close relationships with ICE officers. For example, Alamance County, Randolph County. There's about 11 counties that currently have an agreement of collaboration with ICE. So this happens in multiple counties across the state. Okay, so this kind of family separation happens when somebody's going to their probation appointment. We started getting reports of detentions happening at courts in like 2019, early 2020 as well, and then in the jails. A third kind is work site raids. And so this is kind of where they either get permission or they bring a warrant into a work site and they conduct inspections of folks that are working in that place. And so this is where we saw a lot of people in 2018 and 2019, for example. We would see hundreds of people be arrested in 1 week span, right? And they would be because they would go after the factors where they knew that there were heavily Latino workers. And then the fourth kind of family separation that we see is people that are detained at regular check-ins at federal agencies. And so, for example, my family had to do this for a really long time. It's like, okay, when you finally start to apply for a status, you have to be in regular communication with the Citizenship Immigration Services. And so they give you appointments. Sometimes it's once a year, sometimes it's once every 6 months. And so what we started seeing from 2017 to 2020 is that people were now being detained, and what they would walk in thinking it was a normal follow-up, just like they had been doing for years. And all of a sudden, they were actually told that they had 30 days to get out, or sometimes the ICE agent would be waiting right there and then. So these are some of the ways that we have seen how families across the state, across our state, are separated. At the same time, it's important to know that this was happening in our community, and we also had community members that were actively protecting each other and taking action to resist these things and to spread information. And so one of the things that at Siembra is that we created a community defense model. And what we did was we organized workers for better working conditions. So for example, I mentioned that wage theft is the #1 issue. And so in the last few years, we've actually been able to organize volunteers and workers to be able to follow and create public pressure campaigns to win back wage theft. And so just alone this year, we've actually been able to get back $200,000 back in stolen wages this year, which is incredible work, considering this is all volunteer work of folks coming together and talking to their bosses and demanding that they pay or start a payment plan, right, if they can't afford the full amount. We also started training and doing outreach for Latinos community, going door by door. So we were going door by door, showing people this is what a warrant looks like. You can ask them to slide the warrant under the door. Do not open that door. If they say that they're police, but they're actually not wearing any kind of police identification, you can ask for an ID. Because what we saw is that many times ICE agents would actually lie and say that they were with local police. And so people would comply thinking, okay, well, a police officer's just asking me to open the door. And then before they knew it, it was an ICE agent that came into their home and detained them. So yeah, we trained our folks how to identify ICE agents and also what their rights were, what their constitutional rights were, and how they could defend them. We also, like I mentioned, set up a Spanish language defense hotline. So this was run 24 hours where folks could call in to verify any rumor, but also just to get resources. And then alongside that, when we would verify, if it was, for example, a rumor that was spreading very quickly, we would send out text messages alerting people that we actually just verified that it was a police checkpoint on this street, or that there was no ICE activity when our volunteer got there, etc. So we kept having an alert system so that folks can really trust a mechanism to verify instead of just living their life scared for unverified rumors. And then we, of course, support a neighborhood. So we would create different WhatsApp groups to invite folks to talk to each other. And then in general, we would grab this opportunity to also invite folks into a broader fights for justice, right? We always say that we talk about immigration, but we also know that our Black community and our Indigenous communities have also been suffering different ways of how people abuse their power and how there's institutional racism in a lot of practices. And so we take the opportunities to also invite more Latinos to really reflect on how we need to build power for everybody, not just our own folks. And alongside that is that it wasn't just about Latinos coming together. Really, we were able to stop hundreds of detentions from happening because we actually created a broader network of people who were willing to keep their neighbors safe. It wasn't just about undocumented people knowing their rights. It was about other people who had no danger of being detained and deported and having a family separation, but who decided that this was not okay and that they were actually going to do something about it. And so a lot of what was possible and a lot of what we believe is going to get us in the next 4 years is understanding at the bottom line, which my dad would say is exactly what his faith is based on, which is this idea that we take care of each other, we love each other. And so we got to do that. And for folks in this call, I'm actually not really seeing a lot of faces on the call, so I can't say, but for folks that were part of some of these efforts, just want to give folks a shout out because I know there were a lot of folks all over the state that were part of some of these efforts. And so some of the things that we did together was, for example, we raised money for families that were detained. A lot of the times the detentions happened, they were, for example, it was a father and a husband, and he was the sole breadwinner of the entire family. And so not only all of a sudden did the family have to figure out how to pay for an attorney that's going to cost tens and thousands of dollars, but all of a sudden, right, the stay-at-home mom who had been taking care of the kids while the dad was going to work is now having to figure out how she's going to take care of the kids and pay for all of the bills overnight. And so a lot of what we did was came together to do fundraisers. Down here, you see we had a cornhole tournament. And we were able to band folks together to actually pitch in and create solidarity funds across the state. Some of y'all actually got to hear from Church World Service about the Immigrant Solidarity Fund. We are grateful that now the fund is actually statewide. Back in 2017, 2018, 2019, we actually were having to create local ones throughout the entire state before Church World Service was able to expand. And so we are grateful that now there's a little bit more of a mechanism to actually have the support statewide. Another thing that we did to take care of each other is that we also came together and did ICE Watch. So what this means, you heard me talk about a lot of the rumors. A lot of the times, 9 times out of 10, there was no ICE detention happening. There was no ICE officer on the ground, but folks were living their life in fear, not knowing, right? And so we made it part of what we did to make sure that we were verifying and making sure that we were sending volunteers not to interrupt, but to be witness to what was happening. And what we found is that ICE agents actually flourished when nobody was watching. What do I mean by that? In North Carolina, what we saw time and time again is that ICE agents did not actually have judicial warrants. What they actually had was what they call an administrative warrant, which really just means that an ICE agent, the director of the department, was able to sign something that looks like a warrant, but that's actually not signed by a judge, but that's actually signed by an agent. And so they would trick our folks and go street to street saying that they had a warrant when in fact they did not have a judicial warrant. And so what we found is just having an ally present who was able to say, hey, I'm part of a neighborhood watch and we got a report about a suspect vehicle. Could you show me some ID? What we saw is that as soon as people were there witnessing the lies and witnessing the tactics that were really just not okay, majority of the time they would actually leave. They would not stick around. And that's how we were able to actually verify when there were ICE agents in a neighborhood and when we got to see them leave as well. Excuse me 1 second. Okay, so these pictures right here are examples of when ICE verifiers were actually able to engage in a conversation with ICE agents. We're able to verify if there were ICE agents, and then shortly after, we're able to watch them leave the neighborhood. Okay, other ways that we supported each other is that we also really fought for different kinds of policies that we could actually get passed at a local level to try to actually prevent, for example, more sheriffs from collaborating with ICE. And so here's an example of Pastor Isaac that was in Orange County advocating for Sheriff Blackwood to actually not hold retainers and create a policy. And so we were able to do that across the biggest counties across the state. Here's also an example of policies that we have actively opposed. For example, HB 370, that unfortunately now is known as HB 10, that has passed, but we had seen versions of this bill that that forces sheriff counties to work with ICE across the entire state. We've been seeing versions of this bill for the last 6 years, and had been able to actively stop that bill from becoming law until this year when there was just a supermajority of people who voted for it. And we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that for folks that have questions. Okay, and last but not least, like I said, it is about keeping families together, but it's also true that to live as an immigrant, to live as a Latino in North Carolina doesn't mean that immigration is the only issue that we're impacted by. We're also impacted by anti-trans bills. We're also impacted by anti-LGBTQ bills. We're also impacted by having the worst labor protections in the country. And so a lot of what we also invited churches, we also invited other community members to be a part of, is just understanding that if we are able to actually take care of each other as workers, we're going to have a better life as a whole in North Carolina. And so a lot of what we did was invite other folks, allies, to help us. Here's an example of someone who was stolen $20,000 of wages throughout 2 years that were stolen from a worker at a Hilton hotel. And so workers at Hilton Hotel banded together, did the math of how much they were owed, and then we were able to organize support to win their money back. And so here's an example of folks calling the boss and asking them to pay up. Okay, so that's a little bit about what have detentions look like in North Carolina. And what have we been doing to take care of each other? Now comes the juicy part, right? Which is we got a lot smarter. We started noticing how they started using these so-called administrative warrants. So we started teaching our people how to actually ask for them in the cars, in their homes, so that they're not actually accidentally consenting to things that actually landed them in an ICE detention situation. At the same time, we know that what is going to be happening in 2025 and what they already started showing us is that they are also talking about escalation of what their new tactics are going to be. So I want to say that because I also want to just frame this in a way which is we also know for a fact, like we don't know exactly how those escalations will work. And I think it's really important to say that. I think there's a lot of speculation in the news about what this will look like. And there's certainly a lot of things that the new ICE administration is starting to say that is really flashy, right? And I'm sure some of us on this call have heard some of the things that might be down the pipeline. But I always really emphasize that we really, just like we built our defense model based on what was happening on the ground, we really won't know until we're there. And so it's really important to just know what might be coming and also know that as things are happening, we're going to be banding together to actually strategize how to protect each other in the new conditions. So with that being said, there are what I am thinking of three tiers of things that might be different this time around. And there are three tiers based on what is more likely to be easier to move versus some things that are just trickier based on staffing, based on money, based on different legislation federally, okay? So the first category are the more likely things that we think are easier to escalate and that we think we might be seeing more of after inauguration. What we think we'll be seeing is a lot more border enforcement. This has been something that has been happening slowly anyways in the last 4 years. And so we think that really there's going to be more aggressive border enforcement period, which is going to really impact a lot of our immigrant communities in the border states. Another thing that we think we're going to be seeing more of is coordination with the jails. And so we saw the bill here pass, which was HB 10. And we anticipate that there's going to be more things like this, where the federal government is trying to actually force more sheriff participation with ICE. And it's important to kind of keep in, if folks have questions about HB 10, I welcome that in the chat because I think this is something that I'm going to stop myself from going down a rabbit hole, but that I'm happy to kind of discuss what are some of the strategies that we're currently going through to protect ourselves from HB 10. Okay, another kind of escalation that we anticipate would be easier and that has been talked about a lot are what they're calling workplace raids. And so coming into to do inspections and big companies and actually checking workers to see if they have status or not and doing detentions in that way. We actually think that a lot of businesses are not going to ultimately want this. And so this might be one of the ways that there might be opportunities to actually have more of a business community join a lot of our efforts. Okay, so that's like the things that we think are the most likely that we're going to be seeing, and the things that we're seeing are more likely to move faster. The second category is things that we have heard a lot about from the new folks that are heading up the new ICE administration starting next year, but that we, based on past experiences, have seen that it's actually harder to operationalize. And so you're going to see this in my mid-tier category. Building more detention centers or training facilities. And so we saw that this happened a lot in Texas in 2017 and 2018. And in North Carolina, we saw that they expanded their collaboration with Alamance County Jail, which right now in North Carolina is the only jail that does processing, which means that they're kind of held in Alamance County Jail I think it's up to 72 hours because we fought for there to be a restriction and when. And so there's a time limit on how long they can stay in Alamance County Jail, and then they get sent to the closest immigration detention center that's actually in Georgia, Stewart Detention Center. Another thing that we think is likely, but might take a little bit more time, is hiring more ICE officers. And so we could see heightened detentions and heightened escalations if they start off having more human resources on the ground and actually have more folks that can actually enforce detentions throughout North Carolina. This has been something that in the past they had always threatened in North Carolina, but in reality, it was actually really hard to fill and retain these positions. Another thing we think is likely, but may take more time, is starting to implement expedited removals. There's a few things that can be done at the executive order, for example, that says that if you've been here less than 2 years, then the government doesn't owe you fair trial. And so this is called expedited removal, meaning that they can expedite your deportation. And so one of the things that we've started remixing in our Know Your Rights trainings, for example, is preparing people and families to start actually bringing documentation that they've been around longer than 2 years, just to be safe. So that might be one of the things that we have to keep our eye on. And last and certainly not least, I mean, you know, the from 2017 to 2020, we saw how they tried to remove DACA, and we saw how it got tied up in court. And it has been an ongoing judicial process at this point. And there is a big question on, you know, how fast can they actually move to cancel DACA? And then there's some other programs that we believe are going to be endangered, like temporary protection status, TPS, and DALE, that was introduced under the Biden administration. And DALE, for folks who may not have heard, it's just it's similar to DACA in that it's an executive order. It's a temporary protection status, but DALE is actually geared towards workers who speak up against work site abuses. And so this has been a huge win in terms of workers throughout the entire country who have gone through different kinds of labor abuses that have been able to actually go through the process of holding their employer accountable and then receiving protection temporarily from deportation. And then the third category is the last category, and this is the category of just the things that are really crazy. Like, these are the things that would be highly unpopular probably, that a lot of our folks are obviously rightfully so scared of, but that are going to be really hard to pull off in terms of the legality around them and just how popular or unpopular we think that they're going to have to combat public opinion. That would be like things like birthright citizenship, right? And that would be things like detaining entire families. We've never seen these two things actually be able to remotely start to move. And these are things that we've heard just different folks in power always threaten to do. And so we mention them because this is true that there's a lot of noise around this. It's also true that this is not something that would be able to move quickly. And that there will be a lot of legal battles to try to stop or at least slow this down. Okay, so I talked a lot now about what the threats have looked like, how we've protected each other, and then we've also talked quite a bit about some of the things that we think are going to be moving in 2025. And so I actually want to pause right here. I've been kind of just sharing, and I haven't necessarily looked in the chat to see what questions folks have.
Kelly, I have been monitoring the chat for you in case some of those questions scrolled past you. This one should be easy. The first one I want to pitch is, how can people become involved in the counties that are not covered by Siembra? So particularly Mecklenburg County. I'm sure you have allies across the state that you could point us to.
Yeah, I think that Mecklenburg in particular, there is an organization that's called Carolina Migrant Network that does a lot of, especially legal representation. They're actually the only organization in the state that provides completely free bond support to apply for bond. And so I think There's definitely folks that have been doing really great work in places like Mecklenburg, for example. There's not really another organization that's doing the type of work that we do in terms of like this membership model and kind of this like mutual aid network, uh, is what I'll say. But for those counties that we're not currently in, what we say is invite us anyways. So if there's a church, if you're a teacher, for example, and you're really worried about your parents and you have a group of parents that want information about how to protect each other, we still do a lot of our training and we still do a lot of text messaging hotline support outside of just the counties where we have members. And so definitely just ask folks to reach out with what it is that they might want. And I think we could take it from there. Um, so that's what I'll say. A lot of the work is statewide. It's just that we're not in this deeper kind of work until we have members that want to do committees.
Maybe we could do some membership drives for you in these counties. That might be
Yeah.
a useful way for the churches to be engaged. This
Yep.
next question, I think even I know the answer to this one. The program under which most Ukrainians are permitted to be in the country is TPS, is it not, for the most part?
I think they had expanded it, yes. So temporary protection. Historically, this has been the category that gets expanded the most when there is political turmoil and just humane crisis. And so I th I think it is, but I can't 100% say. What I will say is that over the years, they've expanded it to places like El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua. Um, and so I mean, if they get rid of that program. And I always say this, like, y'all, for example, my aunts, right, have been here since 1980. 1980 under TPS. And so I just mentioned that because it's a lot of the folks who migrated in the last few years, but it's also people who are now grandparents to US citizens who have their entire lives here. So I always like to set that tad bit because I think that is the level of impact that we're talking when we're talking about TPS.
I think that's really important for us to pay attention to because we do tend to think of TPS as something that is just an emergency situation. And once that emergency goes away, then, everybody goes home and lives happily ever after, but not when home is here. So this next question is a little more complicated. It, the question came in, has Siembra ever been threatened by ICE as an organization or have other entities threatened you? And then that sort of leads me to think about Trump's threat that he's going to rescind nonprofit status for those of us who disagree with him, which is like half the country. So,
Yeah.
but maybe you could answer the question about having been under threat in the past.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, to answer the question, no. We have never been directly threatened by ICE in any kind of way that directly points out to Siembra. I think that historically we have also known to utilize the places that have been known as safe places and have been respected in this country as safe places, like working with churches, right? Like churches had a huge impact in terms of the sanctuary movement, right? Like so we worked with churches to hold meetings where we know that our members would be safe. So we've done things historically to work with schools, to work with churches, to keep our folks safe, and we've never been targeted directly. I think that there is a lot of questions unknown around what's going to happen with our safety, like what little safety places that we have been able to have historically in the country and whether that's going to be jeopardized or not. That's a real question. And what I know is that we're not gonna give in without a fight. So where, these are places that I think we can really contest for that I think we'll have a lot of say. In terms of the 501(c)(3) status, look, I don't know. The reality is that there's a lot of fear for a lot of organizations around that, which makes sense. What I know is that we don't anticipate that Siembra is the bigger fish to fry here. And so there are other folks who are doing really amazing work, who I think we're building relationships with. And so I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation as we start to see how things shake up. Um, what I do know is that we had been doing this as volunteers before we had a C3, and what I know is that we're deeply committed to do this work, um, even if it's without the Siembra logo. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out.
Well, as a leader of our own C3, I think what you just said is exactly true. The work doesn't have to be called nonprofit work. It just means that people who give us money can't count it as a charitable contribution. Um, at any rate, the work will go on.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. Uh, those are all the questions that are in the window. But I wondered, Kelly, I know Church World Service National did a big presentation last week on sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
I did not catch that. I don't know if you got it or maybe if anybody on the screen got it, but I found that interesting that they were doing all the information around sanctuary when we've been hearing that churches, schools, and hospitals are probably not going to be respected as safe places in this go round. Do you know anything about that presentation they did?
I don't know about the presentation itself. I think that I think this will be something we're going to be seeing more of. I think there's going to be a lot of workshops, a lot of trainings around this kind of stuff. So I'm not surprised, but I was not able to attend. I think to your point, yeah, I mean, it's a real question. It's a real question if they're going to be coming into hospitals, to schools, to churches, and trying to actually detain people at these places. What I know is that that is a precedent we had never seen before, and that I think is going to drastically change what our movement looks like. Um, and so I think that those are the places where it's important to come back and ask people who are directly impacted and say, what do we risk here? And so I think that, yeah, I think that those are the kind of places where we really have to fight. We really have to fight not to lose ground. And that I think we can actually bring a broader amount of people to support us.
I think you're right. I think when they start impacting our schools and our churches, there'll be a groundswell of support out there.
And I think that's exactly why it's important. And I really just want to applaud y'all for starting the conversation early. Because I think the earlier we can start banding together, the more we have more people. If something starts to happen, we have something to invite people into.
Good point. So there are no more questions, and you hinted at giving us a little more information on HB 10. So maybe you could take a few minutes. Don't go down that rabbit hole you threatened, but just a oversight of how
Yeah.
HB 10 is going to change things.
Yeah, so I can talk about HB 10, and as I'm sharing more about HB 10, folks, please feel free to add in the chat, whether it be questions, whether it be concerns. I think this is a really good space for us to be able to talk about some of the stuff that has been on our minds and some of the stuff that we need to prepare for next year. So HB 10, I think like I had mentioned, there essentially for many, many years, this bill has been trying to pass. And this year is the first year that there was a supermajority support um, that overrode the veto of the governor. And so this is not a coincidence. We know that the math of who was going to be in power next year wasn't going to look the same. We knew that there wasn't enough support probably next year for this bill. And so I think they were trying to get it out of the pipeline as before they couldn't. What is important to know about HB 10 is that it's written in a really weird way, in a really weird way that a lot of attorneys are able to see ways that there are loopholes around ICE, around sheriffs being able to actually say no to ICE collaboration. And so what we know is that um, they're not forcing every county to sign a 287G agreement, which is a specific kind of agreement between a sheriff and ICE that says that they will directly be in communication every time someone gets detained. They'll run them through the database, and then that database will ping them if they don't have papers, that then will ping ICE to come pick them up or not, right? So that is like a direct and concrete agreement that 11 counties have across the state of North Carolina, including Alamance, for example, that plays a huge role in the Triangle counties in terms of their role. That being said, what this means is because they're not forcing 287G agreements, it means that there is some discretion of each sheriff department to decide how to collaborate with ICE. And so we have been having ongoing closed door conversations with some of the sheriffs who have historically not honored detainers and have historically not been in direct communication with ICE. And so there's going to be opportunities for us to actually organize sheriffs around them actually being as open and as non-communicative as the policy actually allows. And so that is stuff that's not going to be public on newspaper, because we know that the minute that some of these sheriffs come out, we know that there's going to be some retaliation. And so, but I want to share that because I just think it's really important to say this impacts communication in the jails. This does not mean that people are going, that police officers are now going to be pulling someone over, asking for their papers, and then detaining them, which there are laws that were passed like that in Texas, Arizona, Florida. That's not what North Carolina has done. And so I think it's really important to say that because, again, we don't want to give into that fear, and we don't want to actually concede and give them more power than what they actually have.
What a refreshing change to hear that North Carolina is not the worst county, the worst state. Because we do lead the way, as you said, in wage theft, and right down at the bottom in public education funding as well.
Yeah.
So, all right, Kelly, I think you've answered all our questions, and this presentation has been wonderful. 4th week of Advent. Now we have our marching orders from 4 different wonderful speakers. And if there's any parting word that you want to give us as we go out the door, we're going to let everybody go early so they can finish their Christmas shopping.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I want to just name what I've been hearing a lot from our members, which is what I've been hearing a lot from our members is we have endured and we have been through times that have been hard before, and coming together as a community is how we're going to survive the next 4 years. I have been really grounded by people who have everything at stake, who are reminding me that we're going to be okay because we're going to take care of each other, come what may. And so I think I want to just leave us with that, because I believe that that is the spirit of the next few days. And I just want to bring that to us as an invitation for us to just be prepared and just be ready emotionally, spiritually to choose to take care of each other. And I'm also going to drop one more thing in the chat for folks who may be interested. The 25th of January, we're going to be having an Ice Watch training. I know that a lot of times we have these conversations, and sometimes we're left with a little bit of anxiety of what's coming. What I always invite people is that the best thing that we can do about feeling worried and feeling the anxiety and this lack of safety is to actually choose to be in action together. And so if you can come to this Ice Watch training, it's going to be January 25th. I just put in the link to RSVP in the chat. You can copy and paste it. And I'm sure Jennifer will get to send an email out to folks as a reminder, but just want to leave us with that.
Thank you, Kelly. This is great. We appreciate everything you do, and we look forward to learning even more on January the 25th. Go in peace, all of you, to serve God and your neighbor in all that you do, and may the peace of Christ go with you.